Stephanie wanted to die the same moment she heard the policeman say, "Your husband and children died and are already buried in the local cemetery. I'm sorry for your loss." How could this happen? 5 days ago, everything was different. 5 days ago, Stephanie came to the sea with her husband and sons. Sun, beach, sand, warm summer breeze, everything was like a fairy tale. Their sons, Mike and Alex, were very excited. It was the first time they had been to the sea. Stephanie was excited too. The last time she had been on vacation was when she was still a teenager. She came to the sea with her parents. After that, she spent all her vacations at home. On vacation, she usually worked in the vegetable garden, cleaned the house, and did laundry. As time went on, it already seemed to Stephanie that this was what vacation was all about. She had forgotten what a real vacation was. The main thing is that there are no appointments, sick people, queues, and endless reports. Stephanie worked as a physician in a hospital and lived in a small, remote village lost in the middle of nowhere. She was madly in love with her husband, Jamie. They had been married for 8 years, but it seemed to Stephanie that every year she was falling in love with her husband even more, dissolving into him. But in fact, it was impossible not to love him. Jamie was a handsome man. He was smart, caring, and so dear. They met in the city when Stephanie was graduating from medical college, and he was graduating from the University of Public Service. They were young, full of energy, and bold, and got married 3 months after they met. After graduation, they decided to go to Stephanie's homeland. The young professionals were welcomed with delight in the village. They immediately provided them with an apartment. Stephanie got a job in the hospital, and Jamie in the local municipal administration. He was given a responsible position related to public procurement. Everything was great. Stephanie's parents were very happy. Their daughter was with them, and their son-in-law was a good man. But there was something negative in their seemingly perfect life. Stephanie could not get pregnant. She was a doctor herself, but no treatment helped. Several years passed, and she already accepted her infertility diagnosis. But suddenly, she felt some kind of malaise. At first, as a physician, she suspected all the worst diseases. And then, an elderly nurse, Lauren, asked her with a slight squint, "How long ago did you take a pregnancy test, Stephanie?" Stephanie knew it was impossible, but she took the test anyway and almost fell over with surprise. 2 stripes. The girl told Jamie the news. He couldn't believe it. And then picked up Stephanie in his arms and spun her around for a long time while Stephanie laughed with happiness. And when it was clear that they would have 2 babies at once, she thanked God that he had had mercy on her. Mike and Alex were born 7 minutes apart, 7 happy minutes. Stephanie believed her children would have a long and happy life. Jamie was so proud that now he had 2 heirs, and he loved his wife madly. He nearly worshipped her. That's how they lived. 5 years had passed since their sons were born. All those years flew by like a blink of an eye. In the beginning, Stephanie took maternity leave, but when the children went to kindergarten, she returned to work. She was very tired of working at the hospital, but she never complained and never wanted a different life. Jamie had been working hard all this time too. Everyone in the administration respected him. He often went on various business trips, and his colleagues often asked him for advice. He was a very important person in their village. Unfortunately, he didn't have time for vacations either. But one day, on a summer evening, he suddenly surprised Stephanie. "Honey, what don't we go on vacation to the seaside?" "Are you serious?" "I'd really like to go on vacation," Stephanie smiled sadly. "We have decent salaries, but there are enough expenses too. I'm not sure if we can afford it." By that time, they had purchased a good house with a mortgage, got a loan to buy a car, and spent a lot of money for their 2 sons. "They gave me a bonus." Jamie smiled slightly, such a nice bonus that at first, I couldn't believe it. He told Stephanie the amount, and she even opened her mouth in shock. "What's that money for?" she asked her husband. "For a great job," he laughed. "So, I wonder, should we pay off the rest of the mortgage or go on vacation?" "Let's go on vacation." Stephanie shook her blonde curls. "And the mortgage, we come back from vacation and pay it off." And so, tickets were paid, bags were packed. Soon, the whole family was on their way to the sea. Adults and children were in anticipation of a great vacation. Upon arrival at the hotel, the four of them hastily dropped their suitcases and went to the beach. They were swimming, sunbathing, eating some delicious food, and drinking cocktails. As a doctor, Stephanie resisted it at first, but then she left her worries behind. It wasn't every day that they had such a vacation. They could relax a little. In the evening, in the hotel room, Stephanie felt sick. She started vomiting, convulsions started, and she almost lost consciousness. Jamie dialed an ambulance with shaking hands. The boys clung to him in fear, looking at their mother lying on the bed. Stephanie couldn't figure out what was wrong with her. Poisoning. But even at that moment, she thought not about herself, but about her children and her husband. She hoped that nothing would happen to them. That was the last thing she remembered. When the ambulance arrived, she was already unconscious. Then she spent 4 agonizing days in the hospital. Finally, Stephanie got better. The doctors said it was poisoning. But with what and how is her family doing? Why aren't they coming to visit her? The doctors suggested that some kind of mold could cause the poisoning, but they were silent and lowered their eyes when she asked about her family. But then a police officer came and told her everything. "Jamie and your sons are gone, and it wasn't the poisoning." Stephanie learned that the next morning after she'd been taken to the hospital. Jamie had rented a car and drove with her sons to the hospital to see her. "One part of the road there is very dangerous," the officer told her. "The mountains. Your husband exceeded the speed limit and missed the turn. The locals know about the peculiarities of that road, but nobody told him." The car Jamie and his sons were in went off the road. Rescuers quickly pulled them out, but unfortunately, all 3 of them were already dead. The decision was made to bury them in the local cemetery. "It's hot, it's summer, and our morgue is under reconstruction. Now it's a long way to go to the neighboring district," the policeman explained. "You were unconscious. We couldn't ask you what to do. So, we buried them here." "Why? Why did you do that?" Stephanie whispered through her tears. "You didn't even give me a chance to say goodbye to my husband and children. I can't believe that. I know it's hard for you to accept the situation, but you have to understand. It's summer, it's hot, the refrigerators in the morgue don't work, and you were in the hospital," the doctor repeated, then explained. "It's fortunate that everything was done so quickly. It just turned out that the head of the town where they were buried knew your husband." "Who's that?" "Dan, I think. Dan and your husband went to the same high school. Dan organized the funeral." Exhausted, Stephanie collapsed on the bed and cried. The shot of sedative did its job, and she fell into some kind of void. She came to her senses the next morning. "Discharge me," she came to the office of her attending physician. "But how can I discharge you?" The doctor was puzzled. "You were a doctor yourself. You have to understand that we still need to monitor your health. You were very weak." "There's nothing wrong with me," Stephanie replied angrily. "If you don't discharge me, I'll run away." Then she was silent for a moment and added more softly, "I want to visit the graves of my husband and sons." The doctor didn't answer anything, only sighed heavily and nodded understandingly, and then signed the discharge form. "If anything happens, call the ambulance right away," he said. Stephanie shook her head slightly in agreement. However, the doctor realized that Stephanie wasn't going to call anywhere. She was in so much pain that she didn't want to live. But that was none of his business. The important thing was that Stephanie signed the refusal of further treatment. She's an adult, she's free to do whatever she wants. Stephanie went from the hospital to the cemetery. The driver already knew who she was and sighed sympathetically all the way. And at the cemetery, he even volunteered to help find the graves of Jamie and her son. They usually bury people like that in a separate area at the very edge of the cemetery, he explained. People like that? What do you mean? Stephanie didn't understand. Well, those who have no relatives, the cab driver replied hesitantly, realizing he had said nonsense. I'm sorry, that's not what I meant. It's just that the local administration buried them. Stephanie didn't answer anything, only wiped away her tears. It looked as if her beloved and her sons had been buried as homeless people. It was so painful and upsetting. Soon, Stephanie was standing by the graves of her loved ones, one larger grave, two smaller ones. Cheap crosses with name plates with their full names and date of death. I don't believe it, Stephanie's lips whispered. Suddenly, the woman didn't even realize what she'd said at first. But then the idea stuck in her head. Yes, she doesn't believe that Jamie, Mike, and Alex are dead. No, she never even saw their bodies. Stephanie sobbed and then collapsed to the ground. The cab driver was standing next to her, but decided not to stop this poor young woman from crying out her grief. Stephanie sobbed, almost screaming with heartache. Then, suddenly, froze and put one palm into a fresh mound of earth, then the other palm. Then she began to frantically throw the soil aside. What are you doing? The cab driver shrieked in horror. Stop it. I don't believe they're dead, she said, turning to him. I must see their faces. How do you even imagine that? The man muttered. And then, more convincingly, it's over 2 deep. And what do you want to see there? I understand that you're in grief, but please think twice, the man muttered. And then more convincingly, it's over 2 deep. And what do you want to see there? I must see their faces, Stephanie repeated after him and immediately stopped shoveling away the soil. That's what I'll do. Thank you for your recommendation. Can you take me to the police? Sure, the cab driver sighed. But wash your hands, please. I have some water in the car. At the police station, the officers tried to convince Stephanie that she shouldn't even start this nonsense. But the woman was unstoppable. She went to see Dan, Jamie's classmate. But for some reason, he said he was busy and had left town. Stephanie couldn't reach him ever again. So she called her parents. They already knew about what had happened and were also shocked that their son-in-law and grandchildren would stay so far away. They couldn't even visit their graves. It seemed inhuman. Stephanie's father, a former prosecutor's office employee, invited his friends and former colleagues. And soon, Stephanie got permission for the exhumation. All this time, while Stephanie was trying to get this permission, she was living in a small house. A local old lady decided to help the poor widow and sheltered her. The problem was that she didn't have much money, and staying in a hotel was too expensive. But she also had to pay for the exam and transportation of the bodies. Her parents promised to help with that. They tried to collect the necessary amount of money. Meanwhile, Stephanie couldn't understand where Jamie's bank card had gone. The police found all the documents at the scene of the accident, but not the card. The police assumed that the card had simply gotten lost among the rocks. Maybe that was true, but for some reason, Stephanie kept thinking about it. Anyway, she'd figure it out when she got home. Memories of her home were tearing her heart apart. Yes, she would come back home, but her family wouldn't. How would she live in their family house alone? Would she be able to stay in a place where everything reminded her of her sons and husband? All these thoughts drove Stephanie crazy. She spent hours in the tiny room, staring at one point. Kate, the nice elderly lady who sheltered Stephanie, sympathized with her grief and tried to distract her. She invited her to drink tea, to take a walk in the garden, but Stephanie didn't want to do anything. She was like a lump of enormous pain and suffering. She could spend hours remembering how she and Jamie had met, how they had fallen in love, how their long-awaited sons had been born. Stephanie was sure they would live a long, happy life. Fate was so unfair. Finally, she got all the necessary papers for the exhumation, and her parents sent her the necessary amount of money. Stephanie made arrangements for the transportation of the bodies. People tried to talk her out of being in the cemetery during the exhumation, but she was adamant. She had to be there with her family. Stephanie arrived at the cemetery before the funeral service. Finally, they arrived too. Stephanie looked at them anxiously. The pain was breaking her heart. What were they waiting for? "Madam, we'll do everything perfectly well now," one of them said with a chuckle. Did they really think it was funny? Her husband's and son's graves, and they are laughing? The other man, noticing Stephanie's lips trembling, pushed his partner to the side, signaling that he should shut up. "Forgive him," he said to Stephanie. "For us, it's just a job. Although we bury people more often than we dig up." "Yes, I understand," Stephanie nodded in response and lowered her head so no one would see her tears. Soon, they got to work. At first, they decided to dig up Jim's grave. Some time passed, and it was about time for the men to reach the coffin when suddenly there was a surprised exclamation from one of them. "I don't understand. Where did they bury it?" The other also whispered something perplexing. Soon, the men climbed out of the pit. "Hey guys, there's no coffin here," one of them said. The police officers who witnessed the exclamation initially thought the men had decided to make a joke, but soon realized that the grave was really empty. There was no coffin. Steph was confused. "Where's Jamie?" she whispered quietly. Then, turning pale, she added, "Where are my children?" Mike and Alex's graves were empty too. So there were 3 fake graves in the cemetery. The police had some questions for the head of the settlement. Dan was detained at the airport. He wanted to go to another region. What he told Stephanie and the officers was shocking. So what happened to Jamie and the boys? Nothing actually. Except that Jamie organized a funeral for himself and his sons. Dan said that Jamie had contacted him a month ago with a strange request for his own funeral. At first, Dan refused, even though Jamie was his friend in the past. But Jamie convinced him. A decent amount of money helped a lot. Dan bribed everyone to help him get the fake papers about the accident, the autopsy, and the burial. Yes, it wasn't cheap, but he was paid well. "I don't believe you," Stephanie told him. "Jamie wouldn't do such a thing." "Why would he do that?" "That performance was for you," Dan replied tiredly. "For me?" "Exactly." Then Dan told them that Jamie had decided to break up with Stephanie long ago. The thing is, on one of his business trips, he met a girl. They started a relationship. They saw each other only a few times a year, but both wanted more. And recently, this girl inherited a house by the sea and moved here. She asked Jamie to move in with her. He wanted to leave everything and go to his beloved, but his greed stopped him. He realized that he would have to divorce his wife, divide their property, and also pay child support. Jamie didn't want that. But then suddenly, there were some problems at work. The regional administration found out about his manipulations with public procurements and government contracts. That's when Jamie decided to act. While his direct bosses were unaware of his manipulations, he made another illegal deal. And with the money he received, he went to the sea with his family. Jamie planned everything in detail. Dan's going to help him. But what about Stephanie? His mistress helped him get rid of Stephanie. Her relative was a witch doctor. She gave them some kind of herbal potion that was very poisonous. Jamie put it in Stephanie's coffee in the hotel room, knowing that the boys wouldn't drink it. So when Stephanie was taken to the hospital, he played that ridiculous performance with the accident and funeral. It was a great plan, and it would have worked, but Stephanie was too stubborn and managed to get permission for the exam. She couldn't abandon her loved ones even after they died. However, it turned out that not all the beloved people loved her. Stephanie listened to Dan and couldn't understand. And why didn't she sense that her husband was cheating on her? She was sure that they had a perfect relationship. As if reading her thoughts, Dan added at the end of the story, "Jamie is a great actor." An actor. When Stephanie heard that, she could hardly hold back her tears. Did that mean their whole family life was a performance for Jamie too? "Where are my kids now?" she asked Dan quietly. "Probably with their father," Dan shrugged. "I haven't seen them." Jamie came there late at night, helped put the crosses on the graves, and said he was finally on his way to his mistress. Fortunately, he knew her address, and soon the police and Stephanie were on their way there. The settlement was 100 kilometers away from where the story had taken place. Stephanie prayed to God all the way. She begged the Almighty to keep her boys alive. That was the most important thing. And Jamie, he has to pay for everything. Finally, they found the address Dan had given them. There was a small house, a fence covered with ivy, and a garden full of flowers. Stephanie boldly opened the gate, pushing the policeman aside. He looked at her in surprise, but didn't say a word. That's how they walked inside. Stephanie was the first to go, and the others followed her. Suddenly, the door of the house opened, and Mike and Alex appeared on the doorstep, alive and well. "Mom!" Mike exclaimed, rushing over to Stephanie and hugging her. Alex ran up to her as well. Stephanie hugged the children tightly, kissing them and crying, but this time they were tears of joy. "But Daddy said you died," Mike said quietly, hugging his mother even tighter. "And now we have to live with his new wife. She's so mean, Mommy." "I knew you were alive, Daddy was wrong," Alex said, sobbing. "Wrong?" Stephanie echoed. And then that girl showed up on the doorstep, the one who'd ruined her marriage. Gorgeous, tall, slender, blonde girl. Yeah, Stephanie had never been so attractive, but was this doll worth abandoning a family? When the girl saw the policeman, she understood everything, grinned crookedly, and said, "Here comes the end of the performance." The gate creaked, and everyone saw Jamie, and he realized what kind of guests had come to him, tried to escape, but was seized by the police. They took him to the police station and interrogated him. Jamie told them everything. Yes, he had a mistress. He didn't want to pay child support, and he could also go to jail for corruption and fraud. So he had to make up a little performance. Stephanie was allowed to see her husband. "Tell me," Stephanie asked quietly, "have you ever loved me?" "Why should I love you, you dummy?" Jamie grinned wickedly. "Forgiving me, children, that's not so hard to do. I felt comfortable with you and with Emmy. I'm happy with Emmy, you know, though you wouldn't understand it anyway." Stephanie didn't say anything to him, she simply walked out of the room. She was happy, and she really loved him, and she thought she was loved too. But everything turned out to be more prosaic, he was just using her. "Go to hell, bastard," Stephanie whispered angrily when she was already outside. "I can live without you, the main thing is that the kids are with me." Soon, Stephanie and the children went home. Her parents were so happy that their grandchildren were alive and well. Jamie was convicted and given a big sentence for fraud. Besides him, several other people, Jamie's accomplices, were put in jail. Jamie divorced her husband. She had to sell her house and car to pay off all her debts. Together with her children, she moved to her parents, and she had no regrets about it. Now all the dearest people were by her side, children, parents, and her husband. She can live happily without him. Thank you for joining us today on Deep Stories. Be sure to like and subscribe and hit that notification bell so you don't miss out on our next video.